Felix Harper had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure. As a high school teacher in Austin, Texas, he had learned how to manage students' tempers, parents' complaints, and the daily whirlwind of life with composure. But today, as he stood in the doorway of his home, the weight of betrayal hit him like a freight train. The house was quiet. Too quiet. His footsteps echoed against the hardwood floors as he entered. He had come home early from work, eager to enjoy a quiet evening with Gina, his wife of 15 years. But something felt off, and that sense of unease gnawed at him as he walked through the house. He paused in the living room, noticing a faint voice in the kitchen. The sound of Gina's laughter carried across the room, followed by a soft, flirtatious tone. He hesitated, wondering if it was just a phone call to a friend, a conversation that could be explained away. But the laughter, it was different. There was a familiarity to it that struck him in a way he couldn't shake. Felix slowly approached the kitchen. Gina stood there, her back turned to him, speaking animatedly into her phone. She was dressed casually, her hair tied up in a messy bun, but the way she was leaning against the counter, her voice light and carefree, made Felix's stomach tighten. "Yeah, I can't wait." Gina's voice trailed off as she laughed again, a sound that had once been music to Felix's ears. But now it felt like a sharp, cold reminder of everything he had feared in the back of his mind. She was too comfortable, too happy. Felix's heart pounded as he stood there, motionless. For a moment, he considered walking away, pretending he hadn't heard a thing, but the silence in the room felt suffocating. He needed to know. Without a word, he stepped into the kitchen, clearing his throat. Gina whipped around in surprise, dropping her phone onto the counter. Her eyes widened in shock, and Felix could see the instant guilt wash over her face. She quickly snatched the phone as if trying to shield something from view, but it was too late. "Who was that?" Felix asked, his voice calm but his heart racing. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. Gina's face flushed. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. It's nothing," she stammered, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the phone. "Just a friend." Felix took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "A friend? Is that what you're calling him now?" His voice was steady, but the weight of his words carried a quiet intensity. Gina's expression faltered, and for the first time in their marriage, Felix saw a crack in her armor. Her eyes flickered away from him, guilt shining through. She didn't speak for a long moment, the silence between them thick and suffocating. "His name is Jack," she finally confessed, the words escaping her lips like a heavy sigh. "I've been seeing him." The air left Felix's lungs in an almost painful exhale. Seeing him. The words echoed in his mind, reverberating with the sting of betrayal. Gina, his wife, the woman he had trusted more than anyone in his life, had been seeing someone else. His mind spun as he processed her confession. He thought he was prepared for this moment, but the reality of it hit him with a force he hadn't anticipated. He stood frozen, the world around him spinning out of control. Why? The question was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of shared memories, of a love he thought was unbreakable. Gina's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know, Felix," she said softly, her voice cracking. I felt so lonely, and Jack made me feel alive again." Felix's chest tightened as he absorbed her words. Loneliness. That was what had led her to this? He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead all he could do was stand there, his mind racing. The betrayal felt so sharp, so fresh. It was as though the foundation of everything he knew had cracked, leaving him to navigate a world that no longer made sense. He had always believed in their marriage, in their love, but now the ground beneath him felt unstable. "Are you leaving me?" Felix's voice was steady, though his insides churned with pain. He had to know if this was the end. Gina looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and fear. "I don't want to," she whispered, "but I don't know what else to do." Felix's eyes narrowed, his mind flashing with images of the life they had built together, the laughter, the quiet nights, the promises they had made. The thought of it all slipping away was unbearable. "Don't walk away from me, Gina," he said, his voice suddenly firm, the calmness giving way to a quiet fury. "You've already made that choice for both of us." Felix turned and walked out of the kitchen, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision that now lay before him. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for sure. Things were never going to be the same again. Felix couldn't sleep that night. His mind raced in 100 different directions, each thought heavier than the last. Gina's words echoed in his ears. "I've been seeing him. Jack." The name alone felt like a dagger, twisting with each mention. How could this happen? How had he missed the signs? Was he that blind, or had she simply been that good at hiding it? He rolled over in bed, the space beside him feeling unnaturally empty. He could still smell her perfume on the pillow, the lingering trace of something once familiar, now tainted by betrayal. The quiet in the house felt suffocating. Felix stared at the ceiling, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to know the truth, every detail, every moment. He couldn't move forward without understanding what had led them here. Felix spent the next few days in a blur, moving through his routines like a man on autopilot. He still went to work, but his mind was elsewhere. His students probably noticed. He was quieter, more withdrawn, but none of that mattered now. He couldn't focus on anything but the questions that swirled in his mind, questions that gnawed at him until they were all he could think about. Who was Jack? How long had this been going on? And what was it about Jack that made Gina turn her back on everything they had built? By the end of the week, Felix had a plan. He wasn't going to be passive in this. If Gina wasn't going to give him the answers, he would find them himself. Felix wasn't a detective. He was just a teacher, a man who spent his days shaping young minds. But in that moment, he felt a clarity that surprised him. He would do whatever it took to uncover the truth. The first thing he did was start gathering information. Gina had always been careful, but Felix knew her habits better than anyone. He knew the cafes she visited, the restaurants she liked. He knew her routines, her favorite spots to stop by for coffee after work. He'd spent countless hours with her in those places, talking about everything and nothing. Now those familiar places felt like foreign territory. Felix took a deep breath, his fingers hesitating over his phone. He made the call. "Hi, I need a private investigator," he said. His voice was steady, even though his stomach churned with unease. "I have a feeling my wife's been seeing someone. I need you to find out everything about him." The investigator was professional, calm. Felix provided details, Gina's work, her schedule, even a vague description of Jack. The investigator promised to keep him updated, but Felix knew he couldn't wait around. He needed to act. In the meantime, Felix began to dig deeper into Gina's social media, something he had always respected her privacy about. But this wasn't just a betrayal. It was the unraveling of everything he thought he knew about their marriage. He had to know what was hidden. He started looking at her recent posts, her friends' comments, anything that might give him more insight into her life outside of their home. It felt like a violation, yet it was the only way to piece together the puzzle she had created. He found a few things that made his blood run cold. Casual mentions of Jack in passing, pictures of them together at work functions. But there was nothing concrete, nothing that screamed infidelity. Just small fragments of a life that he hadn't been a part of. The next day, Felix received a call from the private investigator. The man had gathered some preliminary information. Jack was a colleague of Gina's. She had met him at the tech firm where she worked. Felix felt a pit grow in his stomach. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but he needed more. He needed to see them together, to know exactly what had been going on. With his investigator's help, Felix managed to track down Jack's apartment. He stood across the street, watching from a distance as Jack pulled into the parking lot. The sight of the man who had stolen everything from him made Felix's blood boil. Jack was tall, with short dark hair and a confident stride. He didn't look like anything special, but to Felix, he was everything Gina had chosen over him. Felix stayed in his car for a while, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had expected anger. He had braced himself for the rage that would consume him. But as he watched Jack, it was something else that came over him. It was a cold, calculated resolve. He wasn't going to let this man ruin his life, his marriage. No, he would take control. He would find out everything, piece by piece, and he would make sure Gina understood the full weight of her choices. As Felix drove away, a small, dark part of him relished the feeling of gaining control. He wasn't going to let Gina's affair define him. He would learn the truth, and once he had all the facts, he would decide what came next. But one thing was certain. He was no longer a victim in this story. He was taking charge. The following days felt like a blur to Felix. Each morning he would wake up with the weight of what he now knew. Gina had been seeing someone else. But the truth, no matter how many times he replayed it in his mind, still felt surreal. He had gathered the evidence, followed the trail, and discovered the depth of the betrayal. Now it was time to confront her. Felix wasn't sure what he expected from the confrontation. He had already rehearsed every possible scenario in his mind, from shouting and anger to cold silence. But as he sat there in the living room, waiting for Gina to come home, a strange calm settled over him. He had spent years building a life with her, and no matter how hurt he was, he knew he had to face this head on. He wasn't going to crumble, not this time. When Gina finally stepped through the door, her eyes met his, and Felix could see the hesitation in her gaze. She knew something was coming, but she couldn't possibly understand the full weight of what she had done. Felix stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Felix, we need to talk," Gina started, her voice shaky as if she was trying to prepare herself for what was about to unfold. She knew, just as he did, that this wasn't just another disagreement about chores or finances. This was the breaking point. Felix crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw clenched. "You're right," he said, his voice low but controlled. "We do need to talk, but not about trivial things, about the one thing that's been eating at me. Your affair with Jack." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, and Gina's face immediately paled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes flickered nervously as she realized that Felix knew everything. About the texts, the dates, the lies. Felix didn't wait for her to speak. "I know everything, Gina," he continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've seen the messages. I've followed you. I know you've been seeing him behind my back. What I don't know is why. Why him? Why now?" Gina's breath hitched and she finally looked up at him. Tears began to fill her eyes, but they didn't reach her voice. "Felix, she started, her words faltering. "You don't get to explain yourself yet," Felix interrupted, his tone firmer now, his hurt starting to bleed through. "You don't get to tell me you were unhappy or that I wasn't there for you. You made a choice. You chose to be with him." Gina opened her mouth again, but Felix held up his hand. "No," he said, his voice colder now. "I don't want excuses. I want answers. I want to understand how we got here." She stared at him, unable to speak for a long moment. The silence between them was suffocating. Felix could see the shame in her eyes, but also something else. Regret, maybe, or fear. He wasn't sure, but it didn't matter. Nothing could undo what had been done. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Gina finally whispered, her voice breaking. It just did. Jack made me feel wanted, alive again. I felt so disconnected from you for so long, Felix. We've drifted apart." Felix felt a pang in his chest as she spoke, but his anger was still there, bubbling just beneath the surface. "So you thought it was okay to betray me, to throw away everything we've built? Did Jack make you feel better about yourself, Gina? Was he the answer to everything we've been through?" Gina's tears fell freely now, but Felix couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He had loved this woman deeply, had trusted her with his heart, and yet here they were, on the edge of losing everything. She had broken him, and though he still felt that sharp pain, there was something else now, something more powerful, the realization that he had to take control of his own life, his own future. "I don't know what to say, Felix," Gina sobbed, her hands trembling. "I've ruined everything. I don't know how to fix it. I wish I could take it back." Felix stepped back, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't sure if she truly regretted what she had done, or if she was simply feeling the sting of being caught. Either way, it didn't matter. The damage was done. "Fix it?" Felix repeated, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "You can't fix this, Gina. I can't just pretend like this didn't happen. You made your choice, and I—" Felix swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I can't live like this. I can't live in a marriage where I can't trust you." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm done. I'm done trying to fix something that you've broken, and maybe, deep down, I've been broken too. But I'm not going to keep lying to myself about us anymore." Gina's sobs grew louder as she reached for him, but Felix took another step back. He couldn't hold her, not now, not after everything. "I'm sorry," Gina whispered through her tears. "I really am. I didn't mean to hurt you." Felix's eyes softened for a moment, but he remained firm. "It's too late for apologies, Gina. You hurt me more than you'll ever know, and I need to move on from this." He turned to leave the room, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep living in the past. He had to let go, for his own sake. Felix stood in the doorway of his new apartment, staring out at the city lights, but his mind was far from the peaceful scene before him. The confrontation with Gina had left him emotionally drained, yet something inside him refused to let go of the anger and hurt. He had been betrayed, not just in a moment of passion, but in a fundamental way. The marriage they had built together had crumbled in the wake of her lies, and now he was faced with the question, what did he do next? As the days passed, Felix wrestled with his emotions. He couldn't let her get away with it, not just for the sake of pride, but for his own sense of justice. He knew what he needed to do. He needed to show Gina the consequences of her actions. He wasn't going to let her think she could walk away unscathed, pretending like nothing had happened. No, this time he would take control. The plan began to take shape in his mind. It wasn't going to be about revenge for the sake of revenge, but about holding Gina accountable. He wasn't just a victim here. He had been a partner in a marriage built on trust, and that trust had been broken, but he wasn't going to let that break him. Felix began to think through the logistics. First, he needed to get under her skin the way she had gotten under his. He wasn't going to lash out in a moment of anger. No, that would be too easy. He needed to be calculated, methodical. It was time to show Gina what it felt like to lose control. He started making plans. He reached out to Melissa, the woman he had gone out with briefly after the confrontation. She had been supportive, but she didn't know the full extent of the situation. Felix kept things casual with her, but something about the night they had spent together, talking, laughing, even flirting, felt different. It felt real, something that had been missing from his life for too long. It wasn't a romantic attachment, at least not yet. Melissa wasn't the person he was looking for to replace Gina. She wasn't his wife. But she understood the weight of what he was going through, and her presence had been comforting in a way that Felix couldn't ignore. Felix knew what he had to do. He needed to make Gina feel the same way he had. He needed to show her what it felt like to lose everything, not in an impulsive, vengeful way, but through the calculated erosion of her self-perception. He was going to make her realize just how deeply she had hurt him. He started by gathering evidence, small things, details that would help him make his point. Felix began to pay more attention to Gina's behavior, watching how she interacted with Jack, how their affair had progressed, how she had distanced herself from him over the past few months. He observed Jack's every move when they were together, how he looked at Gina, the way he spoke to her. There was something inherently arrogant about Jack, a smugness that made Felix's skin crawl. Felix made sure that Gina knew he was aware of the affair. He didn't confront her again, not directly. Instead, he let his actions speak for him. He kept his distance, pulled away emotionally. He made sure she saw that he was moving on. But Felix wasn't moving on with someone else. Not yet. He was moving on in the only way that truly mattered, by taking control of his own life. He reached out to the private investigator again. He needed to know more about Jack's life, about his patterns, and more importantly, about his relationships. It wasn't just about Jack's affair with Gina. It was about the man behind the mask. Felix needed to understand how Jack had wormed his way into their marriage, how he had manipulated Gina. Through the investigator's help, Felix learned about Jack's past. his other affairs, his tendency to play the role of the charming, successful man who knew exactly how to make a woman feel special. But Felix wasn't interested in Jack's charm. He wanted to know how far Jack would go, what lengths he would take to maintain his conquest. And that was where Felix found his advantage. Felix wasn't looking to destroy Jack's life. That wasn't his goal. But he wanted Jack to feel the weight of the consequences, just as he had. He wanted Jack to experience the cold realization that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond just the two people involved. Felix's plan took shape slowly, carefully. He was no longer the man who would shout and argue. He had moved beyond the emotional outbursts. Instead, he was going to use the same tools Jack had used to lure Gina into his trap. He would become a mirror, reflecting back the choices they had both made. The first step was simple. Show Gina that he wasn't going to sit around waiting for her to come back. He had already made the decision to move forward. The second step was a little more complicated. He had to expose Jack, but not in a way that made him look like the jealous ex-husband. He wanted Jack to be the one who felt small, who understood that his actions had consequences that he hadn't considered. Felix stood by the window of his apartment, staring out at the Austin skyline. The city felt vast, and for the first time in a long time, Felix felt like he was standing at the edge of something bigger. His pain had been overwhelming, but now it was fading, replaced by something else, something stronger, something that didn't involve Gina or Jack. It was his own sense of justice, his desire to reclaim control. In that moment, Felix realized that this wasn't just about payback. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about moving forward, about proving to himself that he was capable of standing on his own 2 feet, that he didn't need Gina or anyone else to define him. Felix had a plan, and he was going to see it through. It wouldn't be about making Gina regret what she had done. It would be about showing her, showing both of them, that he had the strength to rise above it all. The days after Felix had set his plan into motion were a strange mix of peace and tension. He had carefully removed himself from Gina's orbit, creating space between them that she didn't know how to fill. She had always been the one to dictate the rhythm of their marriage, the schedules, the arguments, the silences. Now, Felix was no longer just an unwilling participant. He had taken control, and he could feel the shift in power, though it wasn't entirely what he had expected. Felix's absence from their home had created a void. The house, once filled with the hum of their daily life, now felt like a hollow shell. Gina called him a few times, asking if he was okay, if he wanted to talk, but Felix didn't pick up. His silence was his message. She had crossed a line, and now it was time for her to feel the weight of her decisions. But as the days passed, Felix realized that his calculated detachment wasn't affecting Gina the way he thought it would. At first, she seemed confused, even desperate at times, but now she was angry. The anger started to bubble up in her voice during their brief encounters. She had called him weak when she saw him at their favorite grocery store, not even bothering to hide the disdain in her eyes. And when they spoke at work events or mutual friends gatherings, there was a coolness in her tone, a subtle accusation in her words. "You really think this is going to fix anything?" she asked once, her voice low but sharp, as if daring him to explain his reasoning. "You think pretending this doesn't matter will make it go away?" Felix hadn't expected this. He had imagined Gina would be broken, pleading for forgiveness or begging for another chance. But instead, she was angry at him for taking away her comfort zone, for not playing the role of the faithful husband anymore. For the first time, Felix saw Gina through a different lens. Her anger wasn't just directed at him. It was the kind of anger born out of powerlessness. She felt the ground beneath her feet shifting, and for a woman who had controlled every aspect of their relationship for so long, it was deeply unsettling. Felix's control, however, wasn't about hurting her. It was about regaining his own sense of self. But as Gina's emotional manipulation became more apparent, Felix understood that he wasn't just battling her for power. He was fighting an illusion, a relationship that had been built on compromises and false assumptions. His silence, his refusal to engage, had become the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal. but it was also starting to unravel the woman who had once been his closest ally. As the weeks went by, Felix realized that his emotional withdrawal had consequences he hadn't fully anticipated. The power dynamics were shifting in subtle ways, and Gina's anger and resentment grew more palpable. She began showing up at his apartment uninvited, claiming that she had been worried about him. The desperation in her voice felt more like manipulation than concern. One evening, as Felix arrived home from work, he found Gina waiting outside his door. She stood there, arms crossed, her face a mask of frustration and hurt. She had clearly been waiting for him for some time. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice tight. "This silence, it's eating me alive, Felix. I don't know who you are anymore." Felix stood there, the keys in his hand, but his feet rooted to the spot. For a moment, he felt the old pang of guilt, the familiar ache in his chest that had been there since the first crack in their relationship. But that wasn't the man he was anymore. He wasn't the one who would bend to her will, who would beg her to stay, who would convince her of his love. He had given her that power for too long. "You can't keep doing this," Gina continued, her voice shaking slightly now. "We're broken, Felix. You know it. I know it." Felix nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had wanted this space, this distance. But what he hadn't fully understood was that distancing himself from her didn't just affect her, it affected him too. "I know," he said softly, "but we're not the same, Gina. We never will be again." Her face softened for a moment, but then her features hardened and she shook her head. "So that's it then? You're just going to give up on us?" Felix exhaled, his hands trembling slightly. "No, I'm not giving up. I'm just taking my life back." There it was, the moment of truth. This was where the power shifted. Felix wasn't the one begging for a second chance anymore. He wasn't the one chasing after her love. He wasn't the one looking for validation. The silence between them wasn't just a pause. It was a line in the sand. Gina stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a split second, Felix saw something flicker in her eyes. Regret, maybe. But it was fleeting, disappearing as quickly as it came. "I can't change what I've done," she said, her voice hollow. "But I don't know what to do now." Felix's heart clenched, but he didn't let it show. "You need to figure that out on your own, Gina. I'm done carrying this." She opened her mouth to say something else, but the words never came. Instead, she turned and walked away, her figure growing smaller as she moved down the hallway. Felix stood there for a long time, staring after her, the weight of the past few weeks settling heavily in his chest. He had taken control, yes, but the emotional toll it took was something he hadn't fully prepared for. He closed the door behind him, the sound echoing in the quiet apartment. For the first time in a long time, Felix felt something shift inside him, an understanding, a realization. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming his own strength, his own peace. He wasn't the victim anymore, and maybe, just maybe, he would finally find a way to heal. Felix's mind had been a whirlwind ever since the confrontation with Gina. He had reclaimed his power, taken the first steps toward emotional detachment, but there was still one piece of the puzzle left unsolved. Jack, the man who had not only stolen his wife's heart but also shattered the life they had built together. Felix had already discovered the affair, but now it was time to understand the man behind it all. Who was Jack? What made him so irresistible to Gina? Felix couldn't stop himself from diving deeper. It wasn't just about Jack's affair with Gina. It was about peeling back the layers of the man who had so easily weaseled his way into their marriage. What was it about Jack that had made Gina willing to throw away everything? Her integrity, her promises, and their life together? The private investigator had been useful, but now it was time for Felix to take matters into his own hands. He had already started following Jack more closely, observing his movements, his habits. The investigator had found out a few details, but Felix needed more. After work one day, Felix decided to follow Jack himself. He wasn't exactly sure what he was hoping to find. Maybe some undeniable piece of evidence, or perhaps just a glimpse into Jack's life outside the affair. As he tailed him through the city, Felix felt a strange mix of disgust and fascination. Jack's casual, confident stride seemed to mock everything Felix had once believed about love and loyalty. Felix watched as Jack pulled into a downtown parking lot and walked into an upscale bar, the kind of place where people came to forget their problems over overpriced cocktails. Felix had been here before, on dates with Gina, but tonight the atmosphere felt alien to him. It wasn't just the place, it was the man who frequented it. Felix parked across the street and waited. Jack was inside for nearly an hour, but it wasn't the wait that gnawed at him. It was the knowledge that Gina had once been part of this world too. How long had she been hiding it? How long had she been hiding Jack? When Jack finally emerged, Felix followed him at a distance, watching as he entered a building, a high-rise apartment complex in the heart of the city. It was sleek and modern, everything that Felix's life with Gina had once been. Comfortable, familiar, yet somehow distant now. Jack didn't notice Felix trailing behind, too absorbed in his own world, too convinced of his own charm. Felix waited for Jack to disappear inside the building before walking away, but he couldn't help feeling a cold, bitter realization settle in. Jack wasn't anything special. He wasn't some impossible figure who had swept Gina off her feet with magnetic charisma or irresistible allure. He was just another man, another player in a game that Felix was finally starting to understand. The next day, Felix began to piece together more about Jack. He wasn't just a charming office colleague. No, Jack had a reputation, a long, well-documented history of using his charm to manipulate women. Felix's investigator uncovered something that hit harder than anything else. Jack wasn't just a smooth talker, he was a serial womanizer, someone who had left a trail of broken hearts behind him. Felix learned that Jack had been involved with several women at Gina's office, always moving from one to the next with the same calculated ease. He had a history of ruining relationships, causing trouble wherever he went, and yet he always came out unscathed. He played the game of love like it was a competition, not a connection, and Gina had been just another prize to him. Felix felt a mix of anger and clarity. Gina hadn't just been seeking attention. She had fallen for a man who didn't care about her, who didn't care about the consequences of his actions. To him, Gina was just another conquest, another notch on the belt. That realization hit Felix harder than anything else had. Jack hadn't even wanted Gina for the reasons Felix had, because she was his wife, his partner, the woman he had promised his life to. Jack wanted her because he could get her, because it was easy. As Felix processed everything he had learned about Jack, something else clicked. Jack was not just a cheater. He was a manipulator, a man who used his charm and good looks to get whatever he wanted, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. It made Felix sick to think of the months Gina had spent with someone like that, but now he understood why she had been so drawn to him. Jack had fed into her insecurities, made her feel alive again, made her believe she could be wanted in a way Felix hadn't been able to make her feel in years. Felix wasn't sure what bothered him more, the fact that Gina had been unfaithful, or the fact that she had been so easily swayed by someone who didn't care about her. Jack wasn't in love with Gina. He never had been. He had just wanted to win, and he had. Felix, on the other hand, had been trapped in the real emotions of love, the long-term commitment of marriage, while Jack had been playing a game. The more Felix thought about it, the more it infuriated him. He had loved Gina with everything he had, but it wasn't enough. It never was. Jack had given her what she thought she wanted, what she thought she was missing. Felix had thought their relationship was built on something stronger, on honesty, on trust. But now it felt like everything had been a lie. It was time. Felix knew he had to confront Jack. He wasn't going to be some passive victim in this story. He had the truth now, and he was going to make sure Jack understood that his actions had consequences, real consequences. Felix wasn't going to let this man continue to play with Gina's emotions, not while he still had a voice, not while he could still control the narrative. Felix was done being passive. It was time for Jack to understand that Felix wasn't the man who was going to sit idly by. No, Felix was taking his life back. Felix sat in his car, staring at the high-rise apartment building across the street. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow over the city, but Felix barely noticed the beauty of the moment. His mind was consumed by one thought: Jack. It had been weeks since he first discovered the truth, and now, after following Jack, digging into his past and piecing together the lies, Felix was ready. The emotional turmoil had slowly given way to cold, calculating resolve. Jack's name had echoed in his mind like a poison, infecting every corner of his thoughts, but now the confrontation was imminent. It was time to hold Jack accountable. Felix exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what to expect, whether Jack would play the part of the confident man he'd seemed to be, or if the confrontation would reveal a more vulnerable side. But it didn't matter. Felix knew one thing. He wasn't walking into this as the broken man anymore. He wasn't the one who had been blindsided. No, he had taken control, and he would make sure Jack knew that. As Felix stepped out of the car, his pulse quickened, but it wasn't fear he felt. It was something else, something stronger. The building loomed in front of him, a symbol of everything that had been shattered. Jack's fortress, the place where Gina had been for so many of their stolen moments. Felix walked up to the entrance, taking deliberate steps toward the building's lobby. His eyes scanned the space for Jack, but he didn't see him right away. Instead, he waited, his anger simmering beneath the surface, but his resolve unshakable. This wasn't just about confronting Jack. It was about confronting the world he had lived in before, the world that had been built on false assumptions and trust that had been broken. Finally, he saw Jack emerge from the elevator, his confident stride almost mocking. Jack's hair was perfectly styled, his clothes immaculate. He looked like a man who had everything under control, someone who had won. He didn't notice Felix right away, too busy checking his phone, probably texting Gina or making plans for the next conquest. Felix's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward. Jack. The single word was enough to draw Jack's attention. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in Felix's presence. There was a flicker of recognition and then a slight smirk. Jack wasn't scared. He was never scared. Felix could see it in his eyes. The arrogance, the indifference. But that didn't matter. Felix wasn't going to let Jack continue to play this game. You, Felix began, his voice steady, his anger barely contained, have no idea what you've done. You think you can just come into my life, destroy everything, and walk away unscathed? Well, you're wrong. Jack straightened up, raising an eyebrow. What's this about, Harper? If you've come here to make threats, you've wasted your time. I already got what I wanted. Felix took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Jack's. You think it's about you getting what you wanted? No, it's about Gina, about the damage you've done. You think you're some kind of hero in this story? Well, I'm here to tell you that you're not. You're just another man who played a part in destroying something beautiful. And now, it's time for you to face the consequences. Jack laughed, the sound hollow and condescending. Consequences? Please don't act like you're some victim in all this. Gina made her choices. You're the one who couldn't hold her attention, and now you're the one suffering. Don't act like this is all on me. Felix's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his body tensing. The words stung, but Felix didn't let it show. He had prepared for this moment of reckoning. He wasn't going to let Jack get under his skin, not anymore. You think this is about Gina, don't you? Felix's voice grew colder. But it's not. It's about you, Jack. You, who think you can waltz in and out of people's lives without ever considering the fallout. You use women for your own pleasure, and when they've served their purpose, you toss them aside like yesterday's news. But not this time. Felix took another step forward, closing the distance between them. Jack's smirk faded slightly, but his confidence never wavered. He stood tall, unflinching, as though he was untouchable. Felix could feel the anger boiling beneath the surface, but he kept his composure. He wasn't here to fight Jack physically. He was here to make him see the truth. You've ruined a marriage, Jack, Felix continued, his voice low but fierce. But you don't get to walk away thinking you've won. You're just a man hiding behind his charm, behind his lies, and I'm not going to let you do this anymore. You won't get away with it, not this time. Jack narrowed his eyes, finally showing a hint of unease. What do you want, Harper? You think I'm scared of you? Felix shook his head. I don't need you to be scared, Jack. I just need you to understand one thing. You don't control this situation anymore. You don't control Gina, and you sure as hell don't control me. You're just a man who's going to realize that there are consequences for your actions." For a long moment, the two men stood there, locked in a tense silence. Jack's eyes flickered with something that almost looked like doubt, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a sneer. Felix knew that Jack was too proud to admit his part in any of this, but it didn't matter. Felix wasn't here to change Jack. He was here to change himself, to reclaim his power, and to make sure that Jack would never be able to hurt him or anyone else again. "You've lost, Jack," Felix said finally, turning on his heel and walking away. "And no matter what you think, you'll never win this game." As Felix left the building, the weight of the confrontation settled in. He hadn't expected Jack to bow down or apologize, but he didn't need that. Felix had made his point. The past was behind him, and for the first time in a long time, he could breathe again. Felix woke up to the soft sound of the rain tapping against the window. The world outside bathed in a gray haze that matched the stillness inside him. It had been a few weeks since his final confrontation with Jack. He had cut ties with his past, both with the man who had betrayed him and the woman who had once been his everything. In that moment of finality, Felix had found peace, not in revenge, but in the decision to reclaim his life. The days following his meeting with Jack were filled with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Felix had no illusions about what had happened. There was no dramatic instant resolution. But what had changed was him. He had stepped into the version of himself that he had pushed aside for far too long, the man who wasn't afraid to stand up for himself, the man who was worthy of love, of respect, and of trust. Still, peace was something that came in waves. Some mornings, Felix woke up feeling like a different person entirely, stronger, more sure of himself. On other mornings, the scars of betrayal still felt fresh, the echoes of Gina's betrayal too sharp to forget. But with each passing day, the weight grew lighter. He no longer felt like he was drowning in his emotions. Instead, he was learning to swim. The first few weeks after his confrontation with Jack and the end of his marriage had been disorienting, but now, something had shifted. Felix had begun to focus on the little things that once brought him joy. He started picking up hobbies he had long abandoned, like painting, something he had loved but had stopped doing when life got too busy. The simple act of putting brush to canvas was cathartic in a way that he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about painting for the sake of painting. It was about rediscovering a part of himself that had been buried for too long. Work had become a welcome distraction, though there were moments when his thoughts would wander back to the life he had lost. But he refused to let those moments define him. Instead, he immersed himself in his students, focusing on what he could give them, what he could teach them. It was in those small, everyday moments of connection, whether it was offering advice to a struggling student or simply chatting with a colleague, that Felix began to rebuild his sense of self. He found himself spending more time with Melissa, though their relationship had remained platonic. She had been a steady presence, someone who didn't push him to heal faster than he was ready for. Her understanding had been a balm to his raw emotions, and their late-night conversations about everything and nothing had become something Felix cherished. He wasn't sure where it would go. They had both agreed to take things slow, but for the first time in a long time, Felix felt the flutter of hope that perhaps love wasn't entirely out of reach. It was a Saturday afternoon when Melissa invited him out for coffee at their favorite cafe, the same place where he and Gina had shared so many conversations. The cafe had been a sanctuary for them both, a place of comfort and familiarity. Sitting across from Melissa now, it felt like a full-circle moment. Except this time, it was different. There was no lingering sense of longing or betrayal, just a quiet optimism for what the future might hold. "You know," Melissa said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, "I've never asked you about all that's been going on with you. I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want to push, but I want you to know whatever happens, I'm here for you." Felix smiled, the warmth of her words settling into his chest. "I know, and I appreciate that more than you know." The conversation shifted, as it always did, to lighter topics, books they'd read, places they wanted to visit. Felix found himself laughing, the kind of laugh that came from a place of lightness and freedom, not from the dark weight of the past. It felt good to laugh again. It felt good to not carry the burden of betrayal every waking moment. Later that afternoon, after they'd finished their coffee and walked through the city, Felix found himself at peace in a way he hadn't been in years. He wasn't waiting for his life to fall into place. He was creating the life he wanted, step by step. He had finally realized that healing wasn't a linear path. It wasn't a destination. It was a series of moments, each one a little bit better than the last, each one a little bit more aligned with who he wanted to become. By the time Felix returned home, he was exhausted in the best way, tired from enjoying life, tired from feeling something other than pain. He looked out the window of his apartment at the city below, the world moving on, oblivious to the battles that had been fought behind closed doors. But Felix knew. He knew that he had won. The next morning he woke up with a sense of clarity. He had taken the time to heal, to grow, and now it was time to truly let go of the past. He had learned what he needed to learn, and though the scars would remain, they didn't define him anymore. He was moving forward, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And in that moment, Felix realized that, for the first time in years, he was genuinely excited about what lay ahead. He was ready for whatever the future had to offer, whether it involved Melissa or someone else, or even if it meant walking alone for a while longer. He knew now that he didn't need someone else to complete him. He had always been whole, just waiting to realize it. As he walked out the door that morning, Felix felt a lightness he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the freedom from Gina, from Jack, or from his past. It was the freedom of knowing who he was. He was Felix Harper, and he was enough. The finality of divorce was something Felix had never fully prepared for. It wasn't just the legal paperwork or the dividing of assets. It was the acknowledgement that the life he had once dreamed of, the future he had imagined with Gina, was no longer his. It was gone. The marriage that had once seemed invincible had fallen apart piece by piece, until there was nothing left to salvage. Felix had come to terms with it, but that didn't make it any easier. The past few weeks had been a blur of final meetings with lawyers, paperwork that felt endless, and conversations with Gina that never seemed to reach any meaningful conclusion. But now, as he sat in his lawyer's office, the weight of the decision felt both heavy and liberating at the same time. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," his lawyer said, handing him the final set of documents. "But it's all signed and sealed. You're officially free to move on." Felix nodded, but the words barely registered. He had already moved on in many ways, emotionally, mentally, but the process of legally separating their lives, of making the end official, still felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about getting a divorce. It was about closing a chapter of his life that had been full of love, betrayal, and, ultimately, loss. The moment he signed the final papers, something inside him shifted. It was as if he had finally released himself from the chains that had bound him to a broken past. He wasn't a victim of Gina's betrayal anymore. He wasn't the man she had left behind. Felix had found his own strength in the silence, in the quiet moments where he allowed himself to heal and grow. That night, as Felix sat in his apartment, staring at the signed divorce papers on his desk, he felt a deep sense of closure. It wasn't a triumphant victory or an overwhelming sense of loss. It was simply a calm acknowledgement that he had done everything he could to save his marriage. But now it was time to let go. He couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't his to hold anymore. Felix had learned that closure wasn't about getting an apology from Gina or about seeking retribution. It was about accepting the truth, embracing the pain, and moving forward without looking back. The phone rang, and for a moment Felix thought about ignoring it, but something told him that he needed to answer. When he picked up, it was Gina on the other end, her voice low and tentative. "Felix, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know how much I regret everything that's happened." Felix closed his eyes, taking a slow breath before responding. He had expected this call, but it still felt like a strange and hollow moment. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate her apology, but it was too little, too late. "I appreciate you saying that," he said quietly. "But it's done, Gina. We both know that. It's been done for a while now." There was a long pause on the other end, and Felix could almost hear the weight of the silence, the unspoken words that hung between them. "I hope you find happiness, Felix," Gina said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "I really do." Felix didn't respond right away. He thought about all the moments they had shared, their first date, their wedding day, their quiet mornings together, and he realized something. He had loved her deeply, but that love had been tainted by lies and betrayal, and as painful as it was to admit, he couldn't keep holding on to it. He couldn't keep holding on to her. "I'm moving on," Felix finally said, his voice firm yet gentle. "We both need to. I hope you find peace, Gina." The line went quiet, and for a moment Felix thought she might say something more, but she didn't. The call ended with a soft click, and Felix was left with the quiet hum of the room around him. The past was behind him. It was time to step into the future, whatever that might look like. Felix didn't know what his future held, whether it would be with Melissa, whether he would meet someone new, or whether he would remain alone for a while longer. But one thing was certain. He was no longer afraid of being alone. He had learned to rely on himself, to find strength in his own decisions, and to trust that he was capable of navigating the world on his own terms. The following week, Felix moved into a new place. It wasn't much, just a small apartment, but it was his. It was a space that he could call his own, a place where he could continue to heal, continue to grow. He spent the first few nights organizing his things, setting up his furniture, and slowly turning the space into something that felt like home. It wasn't about escaping his past. It was about creating something new, something that was his to shape. Felix had always thought of home as something external, something shared between two people, but now he realized that home could be a place inside himself. He was finally at peace with the person he had become. The divorce, the heartbreak, the pain, it had all led him here, to this moment, to a version of himself that was stronger, more self-aware, and more capable of creating the life he wanted. As he sat on his couch looking out the window at the city lights, Felix smiled softly to himself. It wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of his new life, his new path, and for the first time in a long time, he was excited about what was to come.